All right, let's discuss this further with cultural expert and political analyst, Dr. Fikile Vilakazi. Doc, good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on this evening. The religious, or shall I say, cultural practice of slaughter of animals in South Africa, it seems to now and again draw some kind of complaints, especially from members who are outside, maybe communities who don't subscribe to those kind of practices. But let's talk firstly about the right to conduct these ceremonies. I mean, it's enshrined in our constitution, I believe so, but are there specifics as to how these ceremonies should be practiced?
Good evening, Thabo, and to viewers at home. Different cultural communities have got different rights when it, ritual practices when it comes to slaughtering. And I must preface, Thabo, by saying, that what the Commander-in-Chief, Julius Malema, of the Economic Freedom Fighters and members of the EFF did during the slaughtering is actually a ritual that is very, very common, in particular in African culture and many other, cultures. I can even look at some of the religions like Islam who actually slaughter in certain ways. So it's a practice that is very, very common, and we all do it differently. And I'm speaking here also as a traditional healer in South Africa, where animals, the relationship that we have with animals is considered a sacred relationship that ushers us into a particular place of communication with, higher beings, or what we consider spiritual beings, or ancestors and ancestresses. And I think that in looking at the manner in which the Commander-in-Chief has slaughtered, that context and mitigating factors that led to the ritual of slaughtering need to be taken into cognizance. So there is no one particular way in which it is done. It really depends on the cultural paradigm, the cultural location where one is coming from. Abapedi, for example, would not slaughter similarly as Amazulu does, similarly as the Tsongas do, similarly as Abangoma do, similarly as the Muslims do. So it's really depending on where you come from. And I think that is what would guide whether an act of cruelty has occurred or not occurred. Yeah. And as I'm saying, something has got to be done before, because it is an act of appeasing ancestors. Right. It is an act of communicating a particular moment, a particular incident, a particular thing that needs to be communicated to the ancestors. In this context, I believe it was an incident of communicating 10 years of the Economic Freedom Fighters and the journey that they've been through as a political party. And it's enshrined, in the Constitution, as you put it beautifully, Thabo. Section 9.3 of the Constitution protects every citizen of South Africa. Not even the state, not even government has a right to violate a citizen's right to belief and conscience, including performance of rituals of this nature.
So at this particular point, from what I know from what the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs would have said, appearing in Parliament in 2022, is that there is no national regulation that governs the slaughtering of animals for cultural practices. However, she says it is, I suppose, a delegated a responsibility to the metros. The 8 metros have got particular bylaws that would have been put in place to sort of govern the ins and outs, particularly when it comes to health and how it should be done, even though they're not as explicit themselves. But let's talk about that a little bit, how customary slaughter is handled in South Africa. Who would regulate in the context, for example, of yourself as a traditional healer, the ins and outs of the ritual of slaughter? What is the correct procedure?
Thabo, we don't have one particular legislation at the moment that governs universal practices of slaughtering in the country. There are various pieces of legislation that would be taken into cognizance. For example, if one has to slaughter in a particular jurisdiction, municipalities are expected to put bylaws in place, but those bylaws are informed by your National Health Act, So the Department of Health would then have to issue a permit, for one to have to slaughter. That is just the provisions that we've got at national level. However, municipalities have got to then, develop their own bylaws, which would obviously differ in the different sub-districts in the various provinces. So it's not a one-size-fits-all, unfortunately. And then you also have, in our situation as Izangoma, being governed by the Traditional Health Practitioners Act, of South Africa, and then you also have, in the context of initiation schools, also an act that governs practices of initiation. With all of them, all these practices include slaughtering of some kind. So it really depends on a particular, councillor, on the particular province, the mayoral committee, to decide on what bylaws are relevant for our people in a particular jurisdiction. And it's really not a one-size-fits-all. One municipality can decide that we need to perform A, B, C, and D rituals in order to be able to slaughter. Yeah. You need to apply for a permit at your local local office of health. But they may also ask you to go to the office of COCTA, which regulates issues of traditional affairs. So they are not really the same at this point as we speak in that regard. So
let's try
from national legislation.
Let's try and narrow it down as for the expectation, at least from the NSPCA, and what they would have expected. They are particularly, from their website, what I read, concerned about two areas, or at least two things that they think needs to be completed in order for a slaughter to be considered humane. One is kill the animal instantaneously. In other words, render it at least unconscious very quickly in order for it to avoid pain. How does that work in the context of people who would be slaughtering in a community, somewhere in eThekwini or in KwaZulu-Natal somewhere?
Thabo, the question of cruelty as a concept and as a praxis, it's a very, very delicate property of spirituality. Is a delicate property of us as humans, because it's arbitrary. It can be arbitrary depending on where you come from. Let's take the concept of food, for example. Those of us who believe that nature is so sacred that we should not be even consuming carrots, we should not be consuming vegetables, and some of us pray for them before we consume them, because we believe that we shouldn't be fiddling with Mother Nature in those ways. So if you cut a carrot with a knife, you're actually, in some cultures, you're considered to be committing an act of violence against nature. And I think that applies to animals as well in some cultures where people, in the case of NSP, those who advocate for animal rights. And the question of then how many times should you step an animal if you slaughter? Some people would argue in the case of one hit hard slaughter, could be an act of cruelty, comparatively to perhaps being gentler and slaughtering the animal or piercing the animal once or twice, in that way. And it's really, it's complex. There are so many things that are complex in that definition, in that practice, and most of it is it's really at a celestial place. It's really spiritual. And many people would then say, before you even commit that act of cutting a carrot, cutting a cabbage, or slaughtering a cow or a goat, there is that spiritual moment of even asking for forgiveness to this particular creature or nature before you perform that act. And that is exactly what happened with the EFF. If you recall, Thabo, the EFF actually did umkomboti, which is traditional beer, right? And a couple of other rituals. They went to the mountains to be able to speak to the ancestors. And I want to believe, I didn't follow what they said necessarily. But when you do a ritual of that nature, commonly you would then say, even to the animal before you slaughter it, do your prayers. And that's what the Muslims do as well, so that you are seen then to not be committing an act of cruelty. Yeah. So the definition of cruelty, it's in the eye of the beholder here, and it's really depending on a particular cultural group. So what the Muslims would see, for example, as cruelty, Africans may say it's not necessarily cruelty in our context, because this is how we are calling in our ancestors, the manner in which we spill blood, the manner in which we slaughter, the number of times that we slaughter, the position that where you put umkhonto, for example, which is a spear that you use to slaughter, how you wash it, how you cleanse it, where you put it after slaughter. Yes. It's quite a lot of things, and it's not similar at the moment. And we don't have legislation in the country that is able to create one particular methodology, mainly because of that complexity. And it's a conversation that we are all seated with, and I think that is what makes this case complex. That if the NSP will have to argue issues of cruelty, they will then have to come from a place that says, whose definition in the country at the moment defines what is animal cruelty? Because the Constitution does not give us that definition. We don't have any particular one legislation that does that. It's
definitely not as explicit. But what I mean, for example, anecdotally, what I do know, for example, even in the Zulu culture, elders would tell you, don't stress the animal because, of course, the meat might end up being tough or something of that nature or whatever else. And how do you measure the degree of the stress that the animal would be going under at that time? Because one of the bylaws certainly says that. I mean, one, for example, it says, in the one I'm picking up is from bylaws, I think, in the city of Johannesburg. Maybe eThekwini might also be similar, because I see them citing similar kind of bylaws. May not be kept for 12 hours before slaughter. That in itself could probably have implications for some families who, in some instances, can even keep the animal overnight.
That's right. And I mean, in African culture, for example, if you are doing a ritual, in some instances, the animal has got to sleep over in the yard in a particular place that we call umsamo, of the family, which is a shrine of the family, and it has to stay a certain number of hours, because the presence of the animal, or maybe in a mountain, or maybe in that particular location that you consider sacred for that particular ritual. So, and then, definitions of cruelty differ. Some people would say it is the manner in which you tie the intambo, the rod in an animal, whether you tie it in a leg or in a neck or in the body. Whoever is also touching the animal. In some instances, in some cultures, women are not even allowed to touch animals because women go through periods, right? And then they will say that you're actually committing an act of cruelty because you are making the animal dirty. In Islam as well, we see that happening a lot. People who slaughter are usually men. So there are complexities in this particular instance. Bylaws don't even get to the number of times one should be able to slaughter an animal. I think it ends to a point where you are talking about, how many hours the animal should be kept alive. You shouldn't keep it for a certain period. And it's most of the time about your neighbors. It's about the people who are maybe concerned around the whole issue of slaughtering more than it is about the number of times that you stab or you slaughter an animal, or what is seen as stabbing, which is not necessarily stabbing, because also language is very, very important here. I think that and it's a sensitive subject for many of us, even those of us who are traditional healers. I can tell you now, speaking as Isango Matabo, we have this debate all the time. Many of us who go there and have to slaughter that goat to appease the ancestors. There are lots of prayers that we do. There are lots of conversations, even as you hold the animal and actually point that spear towards it as a performance of a ritual and connection to the ancestors. You know very well at the place of your heart somewhere that this is not you, because if it is you, then it hurts, right? Yeah. But because you know this is not necessarily an act of cruelty, you are aware and conscious that this is about belief, this is about conscience, it's about really connecting a people with their spiritual being, in the manner that Christians would want to connect to Jesus Christ, in the manner that Muslims would want to connect to Allah, and so on. So I think the interpretation should be read as such, and it's about the intention. What was the intention of that performance of the ritual? And my reading of the situation is that it was really appeasing of the ancestors and celebration of 10 years of the EFF, connecting the EFF to their source, which they seem to be believing in, which is the ancestors and ancestresses of the revolution that they believe in. And they did mention some of the names, in fact, of the ancestors of the revolution as they are appeasing the ancestors. And I think that is what I would want to say to fellow South Africans. Perhaps maybe that's an angle that we should be looking at. But I think it's worth also debating from the angle of the NSP in that what is it that constitutes cruelty when it comes to issues of belief and spirituality, and who determines, right? And I think cultural voices would then have to articulate, and they are varied and they're complex and they're nuanced. more than just saying you've
So,
stepped
so
the
let's add a little bit to that complexity. What would, for example, something like a pre-stunning do, or how would that affect the processes and the rituals and the prayers that need to be conducted? Because they're saying, well, maybe you can use some gaseous mixes to calm the animal down, at least have it in a relaxed state before the slaughtering. So they call that pre-stunning. How would that work in your particular context?
In African culture, what we call ubuntu, butu, ujama, the crying of an animal, let me say the voicing of an animal in a particular way. For example, when an animal, inkomo ibodla, I don't know how to say it in English.
Yes.
When a cow.
Ibodla. Let's just keep it there. Some of it we might not be able to explain. Yeah.
To explain it instead, inkomo iyabodla, a goat also does ukubodla, a chicken also does. You know, those are the sounds that you're looking for. And when that happens, there's something that is a confirmation that ancestors are speaking because of the relationship that we have in animals. Remember, we believe that people do not die. Our people really just transition into different forms of beings, and some of them enter into bodies of animals. So that's the relationship that is really so important. So when that sound comes on, it comes to you as a confirmation of the ancestors or ancestresses that you've been talking to, in a certain way, affirming the appeasing that you are busy doing. So it's not just an act of cruelty. And if then you are dragging an animal, you are giving it a pill to say it must not make sound, at least for us, it is not necessarily an act of appeasing cruelty. In fact, we could see that as an act of cruelty, because why do you want to drag an animal and poison it? You know, we believe that nature should be kept as natural as it is, and in the manner that we then have this relationship of feeding to each other, which is the wholeness of what it is between human and animals and nature, the connection that we share. And and it's a simple equation around food. Many people say, why is it that we eat meat? Why is it that we eat meat? And others would say it's cruel. And others would say, but we feed on each other. A donkey will eat a cow. A lion would eat a chicken. Humans eat, chickens and all of that. So it's a cycle of nature. We each feed into each other, and our spirits travel our bodies in those ways. So there's a certain way in which we recognize each other in the different forms of our different evolution in this cosmology of our unification between humans, Mother Earth, and nature. And that's the science of ritualing. That's the science of performance and connection with our spirit beings that we know. And when we perform these rituals, it's really that. So there's a sound that must come out in those ways, not because you are instilling cruelty, but it's the same sound that a person that believes in Christ would say is a sound of worship. When you ululate, when you holler, when you exhale in certain ways, that is the unification that happens at a spiritual level, and it does give you strength. It is your source of energy. It is your source of power. It's a source of connection with the spirit beings, and I think that it has to be done within that context that I've explained, of prayer, of supplication, of saying that we are not intending to hurt, but the intention here is to do that which is necessary in the context of our culture as African people, to connect with our spirit beings and our guides and ancestors and ancestresses. Put your other hat very quickly for us and give us the political implications of this. I mean, could the economic freedom fighters then therefore use this, in a sense, in a political context, where they would say these bylaws, maybe even the enforcement or the request for the enforcement of these bylaws, is one anti-cultural and racial bias? I'm sure that the EFF would do it. I mean, you would know, Thabo and fellow South Africans, that the economic freedom fighters is against imperialism, right? It's against the oppressions of colonization and post-coloniality. Post-coloniality in this case being those things that continue themselves after the colony, that exertion of power in our ways of being as Abantu, as Batu, as people, as humans, as Africans. And I think that's the argument that the EFF, I anticipate, is likely to pose, to say that even though there was this thing that we call independence in the 50s of the African people. There are still elements of subjugation that are staying in our statutes, elements of subjugation that are staying in our laws, because these laws themselves are inherited from the Roman Dutch law, right, which is not necessarily African Renaissance-led legislation. And I think the EFF is going to argue that if you are going to put pieces of legislation that are going to be used to subjugate African rituals, to subjugate African people in these ways, where laws are used to force people to comply to certain cultures and certain traditions, then I anticipate that understanding, of course, the philosophy of the EFF. I'm not necessarily in EFF, but I read a lot about them and I listen a lot, and I understand the manifesto of the EFF being that they will challenge anything that feels like they are in a colony. They will challenge anything that feels like South Africa is being trapped in a colonial form in this post-colonial context. And I think this case is probably likely to lead the EFF deeper into that debate that says this is imperialistic and this is probably post-colonial. And I think that perhaps if there's a bylaw of that nature, it may need to be reviewed and relooked into in such a manner that it does not ever discriminate against people on the grounds of culture and belief and tradition.
Dr. Fikile Vilakazi, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on, cultural expert and political analyst.